So I know from some of the names that Kieran shared with me yesterday, I know some of you will have heard me talk about empathy before. Some of you may remember that when the wonderful Sarah Hendricks was doing the groups, who, by the way, is settled in France and is living the sort of life that she wants to live. So I'm very pleased to hear that, but a big loss to Axia. So one time, Sarah booked a speaker to come, and I think it was a train journey that didn't happen or something, and there was a reason why we then didn't have a speaker. At that time, I'd been working on a PowerPoint presentation around the myth of empathy, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I didn't have the PowerPoint with me, but said I could probably remember most of what was on it. And what then emerged was probably the most interesting discussion I've ever had about empathy with the group and with Sarah. And so Sarah and I just had a conversation, if you like, about empathy. I was coming very much from being a psychologist and also the sort of psychological models around empathy. Sarah was coming as an autistic individual, but also, as many of you will know, Sarah has a very strong academic background around autism. After that discussion, I tried to write up and produce a PowerPoint that reflected that. And you can go and listen. On the bottom of the slide, you can see where the presentation that Dream would have sorted for us. That's on the website if you want to actually hear Sarah and I talking about that. But what I thought it was worth another look at empathy, as it is still, I think the biggest myth around empathy is that actually there's very much of it in the world, full stop. So that's where the sort of starting point I'm coming from, that people who think they're empathic invariably are probably not. So I'm starting from the stance that there is very little real empathy in the world. When it is there, though, it's wonderful. So next slide, please, Kieran. Okay, as many of you who know me and have known me from the group, and Calvin will probably sigh, I love everything Greek, and most of the important words, as you've probably seen from my big fat Greek wedding, come from Greek. So the word empathy is empathia, and there are lots and lots of definitions out there. One definition is that we shared was the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences by imagining what it would be like to be in that person's situation. To sort of unpick that, it could be defined as the ability to sense others, so sense others' emotional world, the circumstances they find themselves in, and then trying to relate to that. Sometimes people talk about it as putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and seeing the world from their viewpoint. So immediately we run into issues with autistic thinkers, because quite rightly, autistic people will unpick that and say, well, sense, what does that mean? Which senses are involved? And how do we sense others? So is that smell? Is that touch? Is that taste? Then there's the expressions like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, see it from where they're standing. And there can be a literalness that can be taken from this, which makes the idea of empathy and the practice of it even more confusing. We also never talk about neurotypicals' ability to empathise with autistic individuals. We always put the weight of empathising on the autistic individual. And I suppose what Sarah was definitely trying to do was to throw that up in the air and say, can neurotypical people ever truly empathise with autistic people? And maybe it's a vice versa, or maybe autistic people could potentially be better at it in a cognitive sense, which I'll explain later. Next slide, please, Kieran. Okay, because I'm a psychologist, let me talk a bit about some of the theoretical underpinnings of empathy. So Carl Rogers, who was described as a person-centered psychologist, so very much about trying to understand individuals' worlds and the beginnings of seeing people as the experts on themselves. He was one of the first people to speak about empathy and define it. And he described attempts at, even small attempts at empathy, it's a bit like throwing darts at a dartboard. So hopefully, if you try to empathise with someone, you're at least going to get on the dartboard. Where it is, from a psychologist's point of view, when you hit the bullseye, if I can use that analogy, if that makes any sense to people, or perhaps try and use whichever analogy makes sense to you. But for me, when I hit the bullseye, which Carl Rogers calls advanced, accurate empathy, it's where you make an empathic comment that the person resonates with, but hadn't even thought about it. So I'm trying to think of how to explain that a bit better. So sometimes where I might have said, it seems to me that you're really angry with that person. And then the individual says, no, I've never thought of myself as angry. I thought I was disappointed in the person. But actually, now you've said that, yes, I am. I'm really angry with that person. And you can almost see that it's not very often that you can get to that stage. When you get there, you can see the person almost reconstruing, rethinking how they're thinking or feeling. However, as with most psychological principles and theories, they are based on non-autistic neurotypical people. And there's arguments as well from other viewpoints that a lot of the common psychological theories and psychologists come from a very white Western perspective as well. So you could argue that a lot of minority views and ways of seeing the world are in some ways excluded from a lot of psychological perspectives. Now, where I think some of the confusion arises is where people think sympathy is the same as empathy, and they're not the same. So you can feel for another individual, but often it's how that then impacts on you. So let me give you an example, and I hope again this isn't too abstract. But if someone was drowning in a river, sympathy is actually diving in the river with them to try and save them. And then often both people will drown. Whereas empathy would be on the bank of the river, trying to get them out without going in. So you recognise that the person needs to be saved, but you're able to think before you act that what is the best way of saving this person, and it probably isn't getting in the river with them. Now, a lot of people see that as the other way around, if that makes any sense. Now, one of the few psychologists who does come, and I first heard about him in my work with people with learning disabilities, so particularly non-verbal people, often autistic, where many of these psychological principles, again, they are totally excluded and not considered warranting any indication that they might need psychological intervention. So one of the few psychologists who doesn't seem to just he comes from a minority perspective, in as much as he views every single individual, regardless of their physical needs, cognitive needs, religious, spiritual, any need at all, that what every human being is doing is trying to construct a model of the world. They're trying to make sense of the world, ideas about the world. Now, from my experience, autistic people are constantly doing this. They're constantly trying to make sense of a world that is confusing, frightening. Just when they think they've got an understanding of it, the constructs shift again. Now, what George Kelly said, that there was these things called bipolar constructs. So if you said someone was happy, at the other end of that would be, and I'm just going to leave anyone who's listening to this to just put, what would you put at the other end of happy? Now, an obvious one is unhappy. But when you get to more subtle ones that often are very, it's not saying anyone's constructs are right or wrong, but they might be different. So if I said to you the word puritanical, which actually I realised when I use this as an example, I didn't really know what that word meant. Now, in some ways that doesn't matter, because my view of the word puritanical, what would I put at the other end? Well, an obvious get out is non-puritanical. But because I didn't really understand it, I had quite a negative view of what the word puritanical meant. And actually, the definition is not that negative. So what's really important is to try and understand the constructs people are trying to use to make sense of their world, the models they're trying to build up, and to find out what is it the opposite end of, say, happiness, boredom. Now, where some of the psychological theories and interventions go horribly wrong is that when you give people rating scales to rate where they are, the assumption comes from the psychologist or the therapist as to what is at the other end of that rating scale. Now, for a lot of individuals, they will be getting that wrong. I'm hoping that makes sense, but if not, I'm happy to try and explain that further. So, Kieran, may I go to the next slide, please? Okay, so when I was training, we really just focused on emotional empathy. Empathy's become quite popular recently, I think, with a lot of the therapies which are about acceptance and commitment and compassion, that unless there was a big move away from person-centered ways of thinking into more cognitive ways, and when the whole CBT movement started. So cognitive empathy was started to be spoken about, and that's trying to understand what people might be thinking, or a knowingness as to how the other person feels, although I would vehemently argue that it is impossible to know how the other person feels. And if anybody says to you, oh, I know exactly how you feel, they don't. No one knows how they feel. Sometimes the individual themselves, you don't know how you feel. You might, I spoke to a little boy yesterday who I asked him what he was thinking or feeling, and he said frustrated, anxious, angry. And I said, and what's making you angry? And he said, because I'm anxious. And what's making you anxious? Because I'm frustrated. So you could see there was this circular, he was a very young child, autistic child, who, given the right environment, was more than able to talk about using these words and then trying to unpick what did those words actually mean for him? What was he feeling? And one of the things he was most upset about was that he couldn't engage in physical activities in the way other people might. So it wasn't, again, unpicking it, I could have made all sorts of assumptions about what those emotional words meant, but actually I would have been wrong. Emotional empathy, and I think a lot of autistic people are very good at this, where you actually physically feel along with the other person. It's almost as if their emotions are contagious. And I think for people who are depressed, and I mean depressed, I don't mean a bit miserable or a bit low, people who are depressed, that my experience is often that you can really feel that when you walk into a room and there's a depressed individual in it, there's a feeling that can emerge from that. And I think a lot of autistic people can walk into rooms and get a sense of a feeling that might be in the room. Then there's, I think some of these pulling apart empathy in this way is probably simplifying it, but maybe helping people understand the levels of empathy. So there's a term that's come out recently, relatively recently, called compassionate empathy, that you not only try and understand the person, you feel with the person, but then you are spontaneously moved to help if it's needed. And that's sometimes where I think autistic people, they are moved to help, but they don't know what to do. Then there's kinesthetic empathy, and that is an absorption of the way the other person is moving. And that, I think, is quite an interesting concept. I think I've probably felt it on occasion. I think you might possibly feel, if you can see that someone's in pain and they're moving around as if in pain, I think that might be one example of where you could almost feel with the person what it must be like to be moving around in pain like that. It could also apply, I suppose, where somebody is jumping for joy, where you may absorb that sort of movement and get an idea of the emotion that might be around. Okay, Kieran, next slide, please. Okay, so to me, empathy needs to be broken down into 3 areas. So it's a skill. I believe it can be taught, but it's a very high level skill. And when I've tried to teach it, there are a few people who learn and develop and can acquire that skill to a high level, but often they are people that have the second one down, which is a quality. So I think there are people who are more naturally empathic, that they start with a really wanting to understand how people are feeling, and you can build on that. You can build on that and teach them. Certainly, I've spent quite a lot of my career trying to teach clinical psychology trainees how to refine empathy and how to get better at it. However, neither of those are enough. So there's a complicated process that goes on. So you have the person who is sending the signals out of how they're feeling or thinking. Then you have the person who is receiving that feeling or thought. So that's the first part of the process. If that's where it stops, nothing else really happens. You just leave the person having absorbed the thoughts or feelings of another person. What then needs to happen is the person who's received that needs to send back an indicator that they have tried to understand what the person is thinking or feeling. Then the original sender, having received that, sends back, yes, that's correct, no, you're way off the mark, or can I think about it? And so the process goes on. So this isn't like one comment, this is like an ongoing process that in a therapy session could be going on for the whole of the hour, where there's this process of sending and receiving and tailoring your response according to what you get back. So it takes a lot of effort, it's highly complex, and I think a lot of people assume that they're empathic when they have not understood what a complex process it is. Okay, Kieran, thank you. Next one. So as I started off, I think there's a myth that the world is full of empathy. I used to run a course called the Partnership Course, which people will know is the underpinnings of Axia, where we believe that people are the experts on themselves, families are the experts on their children, and our task is to share our expertise in mutual, respectful, trusting relationships. So that's the premise of the course, and it's a 10 to 12 week training course that builds on that. And one of the training days is on empathy. And the majority of people on the course would define themselves as neurotypical, although not exclusively, that they started off thinking they were very good at it, that they thought that there was quite a lot of empathy in the world. So we sent people out as part of their homework, as we called it, asking them to look for empathy and also to practice empathy. And that was quite interesting, particularly when people went back to their partners and, how's your day been? Yeah, fine. And then we asked people to go that bit further. Now, I really want to know, how has your day been? Tell me about it. And quite often the partners would go, this is a bit weird. This is a bit eerie. I'm not sure. I'm used to you just going, yeah, fine. Yeah, good. Why are you actually now really asking me? And quite often that was a bit unnerving for some relationships, but ultimately often proved very successful. What they saw instead was there was sympathy, pitying other people, feeling sorry for somebody else, but no real understanding. And also quite often sympathy, not always, but sympathy can be accompanied with, I'm glad that's not me. So a sense of my life is not as bad as your life, and that's a difficult emotion and a difficult way of feeling, but quite often sympathy would allow you to distance yourself. The minute you start to try and be empathic, you enter another world, and you have to then see the world from the viewpoint of another person, and that's can be quite frightening. Okay, next slide, please, Kieran. So I thought I'd just go the last group. These were some of the questions that were asked in the group, and all the questions were great. But this was one that I thought goes beyond empathy, really, because how has it come about that people have concluded autistic people don't have empathy? I think historically, and still now, sadly, their autism has been surrounded by negative perceptions, negative theories. If you think of the original work by Kanner, the children were described as cold and aloof. And the theories that we currently use, there are 3 theories, and at Axia we try and turn those on their head, and we mean that. So if I tell you what the negative theories are, apologies to all of you that know this already, but the negative theories are lack of theory of mind, dysexecutive functioning, and lack of central coherence. Now, what we try and do at Axia is we obviously can't ignore the major theoretical underpinnings of autism along with the diagnostic criteria, but they're all based on a deficit model. So dysexecutive functioning means difficulties with executive functioning. Lack of theory of mind, it's clear, isn't it, with the word lack. And then weak central coherence is a very negative view. Now, particularly with central coherence, that is the ability to focus on detail and to see detail that other people don't. And the wider context is in some ways irrelevant because the focus is on detail. And to me, that can be, in the right environment, that's an enormous strength. that in a lot of professions and walks of life, we want people who are spotting the detail. Yes, we want people who are seeing the wider context, but neither one is superior to the other. We need them both. So that's why at Axia we talk about central coherence, and we celebrate the fact that this attention to detail is there. Hello, Cal. You just coughed, so you came into view. Then there was a term that was coined in 1950 by John Bowlby, that autism was caused by a lack of maternal warmth, and he spoke about the refrigerated mother. Prior to a recent NAS conference, I would have put on this slide, this theory is now discredited. However, I know, however, so Cal and I it wasn't funny, but those of you may remember the psychiatrist who spoke at a recent NAS conference who brought back all of those theories, and Twitter exploded. But let's not dwell on that, but that was very worrying that theories that were definitely binned and shown to be wrong were still being spoken about. So next slide, please, Kieran. Okay, so this was, and I wish Sarah was here to explain this because she would do it better than me. So it may be about cognitive experiences. So you could argue, and indeed Sarah did, that autistic people and non-autistic people find different things important and therefore have different priorities and concerns. So non-autistic people, much more interested in social situations, social motivation, therefore expect more socially from other people. Whereas maybe autistic people have different priorities and concerns, and are not as socially motivated. Be interested to hear people's views on that. Then there's different life experiences, and of course all of our different life experiences would impact on our ability to empathise, and that could go either way. So some people who've had a lot of awful life experiences are perhaps more able to empathise with people that have had awful life experiences. Sometimes the opposite happens, where you actually then assume that everyone has experienced the same life experience, say a bereavement, in the same way, and that can be a dangerous path to tread. On a more simple note, I know Sarah and I would often joke about things that seem to matter to some of our neurotypical colleagues, and Sarah would say, I really don't understand why there's any concern or interest in that. And therefore, if you really can't understand that, putting yourself in that person's place would be more difficult. We know that for some people, facial expressions can be an issue. Now, we know and it's extreme in inverted commas, some people have what's called prosopagnosia, which again comes from the Greek, prosopo, and I can see Calvin's face now, and agnosia, so meaning that you don't know faces. So some people, and I've worked with a lot of non-verbal people where the face is actually irrelevant, and it would be other things about the person, such as their footsteps, that they would recognise. And that becomes difficult if, for example, the person changes their shoes and so the footsteps change, that they may not recognise that person. Now, often we use facial expression to make a judgment about how other people are feeling. We can get that wrong, but there are certain expressions that would usually indicate certain emotions. However, this again, with neurotypical people, they often misjudge profoundly how the autistic person is feeling, because some autistic people have what I call a neutral facial expression, where their facial expression doesn't give you any indication of how they're feeling. Or we had a woman a couple of days ago, and I think you remember, Sarah talking about this, saying, this is my resting bitch face. And that was her expression. But I couldn't tell how she was feeling. She had to tell me. And people make all sorts of assumptions that you aren't feeling things because of the way your face is. Then there are subtle non-verbal signals that could be missed by autistic people. But again, I think a lot of neurotypical people, it maybe they haven't missed them, but actually they don't care and they're not going to respond to them. So next slide, please, Kieran. So other things around autism that could mean that empathy is either more difficult or not understood. So if you take someone at face value, and a lot of autistic people, because they are moral, honest, truthful individuals, they assume other people are going to be like that. So if somebody says, oh, I'm fine, and they don't detect the subtle undertones, actually are not fine at all, the logical way of taking that is, oh yeah, they're fine. They've said they're fine, so they must be. Then again, another Greek word, alexithymia, which is the not having the words for emotions, or sometimes not necessarily. So some people will have the feelings but not the words to describe the feelings. Some people really struggle to discern the difference between being hungry, being anxious. So that can make it difficult. If you find it hard to understand your own emotional world, you're starting from a more difficult position in trying to understand somebody else's emotional world. Now, this is where I think a lot of autistic people, they often assume they're the ones that have made the mistake. They are often perfectionists and don't want to get it wrong, but their life experience would tend to say to them, they're the ones that are always getting it wrong. So then they're scared. They're scared to say, well, should I say anything here? Because if I get it wrong, is this going to be a disaster? Whereas I think neurotypical people often assume they're right and just say what they think without any recourse of thinking, oh, maybe I haven't got this right. They're just barging in with what they think is an empathic comment because they can't believe that they could be getting it wrong. So my experience of autistic individuals is they actually thought about empathy much more than neurotypical people, because the autistic person doesn't think they're any good at it, thinks they're going to get it wrong, doesn't want to upset people. They're not getting all the cues maybe that neurotypical people are. So this is a really tiring experience. And we know that, we know from a lot of our autistic children that going to school and trying to cope in that world is so tiring. And that when the children come home, that's where the relaxation, let's use what terms like meltdowns and so on, where actually I can't do this anymore. Okay, Kieran, next one, please. So these are some examples that I think these are nice examples, the top two anyway. The third one is funny. So I had a little 5-year-old autistic boy whose mum had lost her mother very recently, and they were very close. And the little boy said to his mum, "Cheer up, mum, it will be Christmas soon." And everyone was horrified. However, when I spoke to the little boy, what he'd said was, well, my mum loves Christmas. Whenever it's Christmas, my mum's happy. So I thought that once it got to Christmas, my mum would be happy again. So you can see the intention behind that, as I put there, was pure. And I think I like that word. I think he really, really wanted his mum to be happy, and he thought Christmas would do it. Then there was another little boy who hugged his mum when she was sad. He didn't really know why he was doing that, but he saw that the people on EastEnders did it. So he thought, well, that's what they do, and that seems to work, so I'll do that. Now, to me, I think that's great because he's actually tried to think about what should I do to my mum when she's sad. He didn't really know what to do, but thought, well, that seems to work. So there's a huge amount of effort there. Now, this example was, those of you that know me know I'm dyspraxic and I can't ride a bike. I've never been able to ride a bike. It's horrible. And Sarah and I were trying to look at differences between the anxiety that can come with all neurodevelopmental differences. And so Sarah was talking about the anxiety that every day of entering the social world, that, you know, there's a starting point of being anxious. And I tried to use the example that if I thought I had to ride a bike every day, I would be incredibly anxious. And I was trying to give that as a genuine example, and my family and friends all just started laughing. There was absolutely no empathy at all. And Sarah turned to me and said, they just don't get it. So I said to Sarah, oh, thanks, Sarah, at least someone understands. She said, no, I don't understand. I'm just telling you a fact. They just don't get it. And that was hilarious. That it, again, she was the most empathic, but actually she was simply saying, no, these people just don't get what you're talking about. And it still remained the most empathic thing that anyone said. Now, when my mum died, people made all sorts of assumptions about how I was feeling and how devastated I must be, what a loss it was, and so on. Now, actually, I didn't feel that because my mum had been ill for a considerable time. And in fact, it was a relief when she died. I'd lost my mum a few years before she'd actually died. So I didn't have those feelings. And I got fed up with everyone telling me how I must be feeling. And then there's an element of, oh, well, am I doing something wrong here because I'm not feeling what they're expecting me to? Now, sometimes being empathic, I've put dangerous, that's a strong word, it can emotionally paralyze you. Next slide, please, Kieran. Oh, sorry, I'll explain. So
next slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So when I've come back to work after, you know, some devastating life experiences, I know I'm ready to come back to work, but I'm not ready for anyone to empathise with me because I know I will crumble, and I don't want that because I want to be able to function. So you have to pick when you're going to be empathic, because if you truly are empathic, that is so powerful that you should only really do it in situations that are right for the person you're trying to empathise with. And I have often come back to work and gone, please don't empathise with me. And then people know that's the cue not to say anything because I won't be able to function then. Okay, next slide now, please, Kieran. Okay, Kieran, I'll hand back over to you then.
Thank you very much for that, Linda. That was great. So now is your opportunity to ask any